From Kansas State University, this is Agriculture Today. Eric Atkinson with you. Here's what's coming up. From the Kansas Wheat Tour, which launched earlier this morning, K-State's Romulo Lollato will talk about the recent run of unseasonal hot weather around Kansas and the possible damage that may have caused to the pollination and the kernel development of the Kansas wheat crop. He plans to explore that further during the tour this week. Then K-State's Kelsey Andersen Onofre follows up with the latest report on diseases in the Kansas wheat crop. Among other things, she'll talk about whether a preemptive fungicide application against leaf rust is worthwhile. And on this week's edition of Milk Lines, K-State's Mike Brouk will talk about ramping up that summer fly control in one's dairy facilities now. All that here on Agriculture Today. You're listening to the Tuesday edition of Agriculture Today. As always, we're glad to have you along. Well, earlier this morning, the participants in the 2022 Hard Winter Wheat Tour of Kansas and surrounding states left Manhattan. This is sponsored by the Wheat Quality Council every year, and it's a great firsthand look at what's happening with the wheat stands around Kansas. Of course, on the tour, Romulo Lollato, wheat production specialist with K-State Research and Extension, and he's sparing a few moments to talk with us primarily about what has been expected of the crop in the wake of the recent temperatures that have been beyond normal here in Kansas. Romulo, thank you for joining us once again. It's been awfully hot for mid-May around Kansas. That definitely, you say, can have consequences on the progress of the crop.
Hi, Eric. Yes, well, it's great to be here with you guys today, and absolutely. So these extremely high temperatures that we are having in the month of May, right, they can affect the crop in many ways, and I can say that probably none of them are actually good, right? So they can really hamper our productivity there in the end. And I guess as anything that is crop related, the different stages of development of the crop are going to dictate the extent of any damage that we can have from those hot temperatures that we saw now in May. If we give just a brief overview on the crop sensitivity to heat stress, right? Usually the most sensitive phase of the crop is around pollination, right? Pretty much by the time that we see those little anthers coming out of the wheat head, that crop has been pollinated probably 5 to 7 days ago, right? That's kind of the time, and there's usually already a little developing grain in that head. If you were to open some of those spikelets, you'd find the developing grain. So when the crop is pollinating, and not only at pollination itself, but a few days before and after there, usually we have a threshold, a temperature of around 88 Fahrenheit, above which we can actually have less pollination, right? It can actually hamper the pollination of the crop, and no grain may be producing those where there should be a seed out there, simply because there was no pollination. So that's probably one of the main concerns that we have at this point is for the crop that was pollinating last week, what could be those consequences, right? Mm-hmm. Now, of course, that's not the only impact that high temperatures can have. So let's say that the crop had already pollinated, and last week we were going through that heat stress, right? And indeed, many of the fields that I visited last week in South Central Kansas, South Central and Southwest Kansas, they were already through with pollination, and we could find a little grain developing. Now, the beginning of the grain development phase is called grain elongation, right? It's probably 10 days after that pollination, the kernel is going to be elongating and just gaining size. If we have that severe heat stress during that point in time, it usually is going to decrease the grain size, right? So we're going into the second effect that heat can have here, right? The first one, simply not allowing for that pollination to happen due to heat stress, if it just matches that very sensitive phase of crop development. The second one, after pollination occurs, right? So those crops that are a little bit further along in South Central, Southwest Kansas, they could still be impacted in terms of grain size. This phase of the grain development, there's a lot of cell division going on in that grain, and it's just elongating in size. And essentially, we can hamper that, and we can have smaller kernels. now I may have questions. Okay, well, but last week my crop was still at the flag leaf stage, or it was still at the boot stage, like a lot of the fields that we were visiting in north central, northwest Kansas last week. What can we expect to that crop? Now, the crop at that stage, again, it could still be somewhat susceptible, right? But in terms of pollination, if it is going through pollination, it's going to be the more susceptible. But it also reduces the length of what we call critical period. So what is the critical period for grain termination wheat? It's essentially a period of around 20 days before anthesis, all the way to about 10 days after anthesis, where the number of grains that we're going to have per area is defined, right? So that's a very important period, because any heat stress or any drought stress, anything that we might have during that period, it impacts the number of kernels that we're going to have per area. Now, I mentioned that it lasts usually 20 days before anthesis to 10 days after. That's in a year with average normal temperatures. If we have cool and wet years, like we have had in 2019, 2020, or back in 2016, that period can last, instead of these 30 days that we mentioned, it can last up to 50 days or more. And that's why we end up with such a high grain yields in some of those years with cool temperatures, just a prolongation of this critical period for grain. Now, the other way around is true as well. If we have heat stress during this time, we're going to shrink that period, and everything is going to try and happen faster within the plant. And so that shrinkage of that period actually results in fewer grains per area out there, and so it decreases our grain yield. So as I was mentioning, many things can happen with the crop, but none of them are actually good, right? It's either shrinking a very important phase of the crop because of that heat stress, or hampering pollination per se, or even decreasing the grain size of the crop, depending when that heat stress happened in relation to the development of the crop.
Well, Romulo, considering all of those possibilities then, not many of which are good, as you say, what telltale signs can producers be looking for as they scout their fields now to determine if they had, pollination problems, or if the crop were, as you say, further along, kernel filling issues?
Yeah, that's a good question, and probably what we would suggest is to give it a few days. It seems like the worst of the heat stress has been between that May 2nd through May 12th. So in that period, actually, I had mentioned a threshold of 88 Fahrenheit for crop damage. And in parts of the state, we had up to 20, 25, 26 hours above that threshold of 88 Fahrenheit. So definitely, we should be seeing some level of damage there, especially South Central, Southwest Kansas, but really across the entire state, we had that heat stress. So we still have more heat stress to come from here moving forward, but it seems more sporadic. A day that is going to be really hot, followed by a little bit cooler day. So what do we do now? What do we look for, right? That was your main question, Eric. Well, let's give it a few days, 4 or 5 days from that worst heat stress. If we think of 4 or 5 days after pollination, we should already be able to start seeing a developing kernel within that spikelet. So what we suggest is to really open the spikelets back and see if you have a developing kernel there or not. It's going to be very easy to see. Hopefully, the heat stress that we had is not going to hamper pollination per se, but there is the possibility. So that's what we look for, Eric. If you start finding more and more heads that don't have that kernel developing, and again, it's important to look for that in different tillers as well as different parts of the head. And why do we recommend that? Different tillers are going to have different maturities, right? So the main tiller is going to be a little bit further along in development as compared to the secondary, tertiary tillers of that plant. And so just that little difference in maturity between tillers, they can be enough to set some of those issues with temperatures. Within the same head, pollination starts about in the middle of the head or slightly above the middle, and then it moves in both directions. So even within a given head, we may see differences in pollination there. For example, if the middle of the head pollinated before the heat stress and both extremities pollinated afterwards, we would see just lack of pollination in those extremities, right, in the top and in the bottom of the head. So we're suggesting, give it a few days, sometime later this week, go out in the fields and scout for that, see if you're consistently finding kernels developing, excellent. If you're consistently finding kernels that are not developing, it may be the case of calling a crop adjuster and seeing what options are there for the crop.
Right. It's going to be an interesting few days here to see what actually results for the long haul. And the weather from here forward will make a difference likewise, will it not, Romulo?
Absolutely, Eric. And so if we have cool and moist conditions, that will favor the crop bouncing back from any stress that it may have gone through. Now, if a given flower was not pollinated, right, that's not going to be pollinated. But if some of the tillers were swatted off because of the heat, we may still see some new tillers develop in case that we have moisture and relatively cool conditions, right? Now, if the conditions worsen in terms of heat and drought, chances are that that's actually going to affect crop productivity even in a worse manner there. And just like a comment that I didn't make before, but even a grower, for example, that has irrigated and dry land fields at this point in time, there's a likelihood that heat stress might be less visible or we might have less damage in the irrigated fields because there is an interaction there with water and heat. And so probably I'll start checking those dryland fields and see what they are looking like because very likely they may be more affected than the irrigated fields.
It has been a year of diverse challenges for our winter wheat crop in the state of Kansas, and this has been one more element to consider here, that is recent heat, the impact on pollination or on kernel fill. There's a pair of articles in the recent Agronomy e-Update newsletter on this at agronomy.ksu.edu. Anxious to hear what you find on day one of the wheat tour, Romulo, as you travel through the northern part of Kansas today and eventually arrive at Colby. We will touch base with you tomorrow and get your observations on day one. Thanks for all of this, and we'll talk again tomorrow.
Thanks, Eric.
He's Romulo Lollato, Wheat Production Specialist, K-State Research and Extension. And we'll be back on Agriculture Today. Continuing on now on Agriculture Today on our wheat theme and the condition of the current Kansas crop, and this time from the disease management perspective, as we brought in once more Kelsey Andersen Onofre, wheat disease specialist with K-State Research and Extension. Kelsey herself has been on a wheat plot tour or two of late and has some thoughts to share on where we are with disease pressure in Kansas winter wheat. Kelsey, let's start with this. We have been observing through comments that you've been making and otherwise the lack of rust disease concern because of the dryness for the better part of the spring. Bring us up to date on where we are with rust, if you would.
Well, that's right. So thanks for having me here.
Sure.
So, we've been watching rust like we do every year throughout the spring, and we've been really thinking about it since the fall, essentially, because we start looking at Texas and weather conditions in Texas back in the fall. And so this year, all the signals have pointed to a low rust year in terms of the dry weather we've had in Texas and Oklahoma, the dry weather we've had here this spring, the lack of that, long extended period where we have moisture in our canopies. So that's lining up with our observations pretty well here. So we have not had any detections of stripe rust in Kansas. That's not to say we won't find a little bit here or there somewhere later in the season, but we've scouted some of the major wheat growing regions like we do every year, and we're just not finding anything at levels that would set off any type of alarm bell. So that's really a piece of good news. And I think at this point, because we are in mid-May, usually when we have a very bad year, we start finding that in mid or early April. I think we are out of the woods a bit for any type of severe stripe rust epidemic occurring this year in 2022. So that's good news. Yep. And I think we've had really low levels of leaf rust too. We haven't found any here in Kansas, and that's something that does come on a little later. Leaf rust does prefer that warmer weather. If we do have some canopy moisture, we might see a little bit of leaf rust, but overall, I'm going to bet that we're going to have a low rust year across the board.
Well, staying with leaf rust for a second here then, and producers are obviously eager to get everything they can out of these stands. When you look at the market situation and what wheat is bringing in the trade now, is there any justification whatsoever for a fungicide treatment against, leaf rust at this juncture, do you think?
Well, if it is applied, if the application's made, most cases it wouldn't hurt, right? I guess there could be cases where there's just such bad drought stress to the crop that if you potentially add a fungicide in there, sometimes fungicides do have that stay green effect that you could stress out the crop a little bit, right? If there's just no moisture. So on these really low bushel drought damaged fields, that might be a watch out not to make an application of a foliar fungicide. But those fields aside, right, the fields that we would potentially target or really think about protecting as a just in case application would be seed wheat fields that have caught timely rains and do have, maybe 30, 40, 50 bushel per acre or higher yield potential. And maybe some of the fields, we might be a little past it, but some of the fields in southeast Kansas, which did catch a little more rain this year and probably did have more risk of rusts and other foliar diseases.
But there's no sense of urgency here, it doesn't sound, Kelsey, as far as rust control, as compared to what we normally see in past years.
That's right. So the conversation we're having is if you are going to put a product on, fly it on, or put it on with a ground rig, this wouldn't be a bad year to choose one of the lower priced products if you're going on as a just in case application, right? If you have one of these, we do have some, late season leaf rust that does kind of come in and ankle bite our tail end yield. But that would really be the best option for some of those higher yield potential fields that we've got.
All right. You say you're getting word from the countryside, and particularly in part of south central Kansas, of all places, about wheat streak mosaic, something that we've heard tons about in the western part of the state in years recent, but now it's seeming to assert itself in that region, you say.
That's right. So in that south central part of the state, we've gotten more samples than we have historically of wheat streak mosaic into the diagnostic lab. So as a reminder, the K-State Plant Diagnostic Clinic does test for several wheat viruses, including wheat streak mosaic virus. And so we've gotten over the last 3 weeks more samples from that region than we have in the past. And some of that could just be due to unfortunately, our kind of big foe when it comes to wheat streak mosaic, and that's volunteer. So typically we do find a source when we have kind of explored why those cases are popping up in those areas. Now we expect that we might not be out of the woods in our western counties as well. So things just may not have moved along as well, or there's some confounding drought damage out there that certainly can mask some of that wheat streak symptomology. So we're still on the lookout in the western part of the state, but now we're getting most of our reports from the central and south central parts of the state.
And just to remind, we are still absent any sort of fungicide response for wheat streak mosaic, aren't we? We're still left to cultural means of control?
That's right. So the best ways to control wheat streak are manage volunteer. So that's kind of number one. But of course, there's always scenarios where we have some grassy host species and other sources, reservoirs for those viruses. And then the others would be varieties that have a source of resistance to either the virus. So that would be in the form of wheat streak mosaic 2, WSM2. That's a gene that we have in some of our varieties in this part of the country. And then there's another source that's actually resistant to that curl mite vector. So, those are really and then we can potentially delay planting a bit, but really controlling that volunteer and choosing a variety that has some level of resistance. Those are the only real tools we have in our box at the moment.
So producers, especially in south central Kansas, where wheat streak mosaic has not been as prevalent, get on board the train as far as managing against this disease as we move forward, and send any samples into the Plant Disease Diagnostic Laboratory if you have questions. And one more pathogen, and as we've visited about in the past, Kelsey, this is right in your ballpark as far as your research has gone over the years. Head scab, or Fusarium head blight, if you'd rather, normally associated with wet conditions, which have been largely absent for most of Kansas, save the southeast part of the state. You think that head scab could make a run again in wheat in that region?
Well, that's right. So we did have some. So what we need for Fusarium head blight is we need inoculum. So we need corn residue or wheat residue where we do have that Fusarium pathogen building up. But we also need moisture. And we need moisture around the period of flowering. So we have some predictive models, some tools, and you can check it out at wheatscab.psu.edu, where we look at the risk based on the weather for Fusarium head blight for scab. And in that part of the state, in the southeastmost counties, we did have some timely moisture in that flowering window that made it potentially a good option to apply a fungicide that prevents Fusarium head blight.
Therefore, producers should be on the watch for that pathogen as we near harvest time, although we've still several weeks before prime harvest. But what should be the game plan on producers' part?
Well, good point. So if there is some Fusarium head blight, particularly in that southeast corner of the state, it's a good practice to scout before the crop starts to mature. So that's really when you will see the symptoms actually in the field, right? And if there is a field that has high symptoms, so individual bleached spikelets, you kind of see those spikelets start to bleach from the center, moving through the head. Sometimes you see the actual fungal pathogen. It turns kind of a salmon color orange on the outside of the head itself there. So if you do find those symptoms, those could be fields that you might prioritize for earlier harvest. So you'd want to get them out of the field first. So you lower the chance of getting the associated toxin, and then be mindful of the storage of that particular load of grain will be really important. If that seed is saved back, it would be a very important lot for a seed treatment fungicide to preserve the stand in the following season. So those are kind of the big things to think about, here after harvest to mitigate some of that disease.
Let's hope that's at a minimum, though. It's such a headache to deal with head scab disease come wheat harvest time, if anybody has ever encountered that. Again, take full advantage of the services provided by the Plant Disease Diagnostic Laboratory at K-State. If you have samples you'd like to send in for analysis, you can do so through your local Extension agricultural agent anytime. Well, Kelsey, here's to relatively smooth sailing for our producers going through and into harvest time as far as disease pressure goes. We appreciate the update, and we'll talk again soon. Thank you.
Great. Thanks so much.
Kelsey Andersen Onofre, wheat disease specialist with K-State Research and Extension, with that briefing on diseases in the Kansas winter wheat crop presently. And we'll be back with more on Agriculture Today. This is Agriculture Today, and time once again to hear from K-State Research and Extension Dairy Specialist Mike Brouk. And on this week's Milk Lines, Mike takes up the topic of dealing with the disruptions caused by summer fly activity in the milking barn and around the operation in general. Mike?
We've had a really nice spring in many ways. It's been dry, and temperatures have been up and down, so flies haven't been a huge problem on our dairies yet. However, that's probably soon to change with the recent rain as well as warmer temperatures in the more distant forecasts. So you need to be on top of your game, because my guess will be that flies will kind of just explode on our dairy farms and become a very significant nuisance, not only to us but also to our animals. The ones that I'm most concerned about, actually, at least at the start of the fly season, will be the stable flies. Those are the biting flies that tend to hang out around the legs of the animals and the underside or bellies of our calves and younger heifers. These actually cause our animals quite a bit of discomfort. Animals will bunch. You'll notice them switching tails very rapidly, as well as stamping their feet, because they're getting bit. And if they're getting bit and they're bunched up, they're not eating or laying, so they're not doing the productive things that we would like them to do, and you'll see a reduction in milk production. So get on top of your game. Number one is sanitation, getting rid of all of the fly breeding areas. That would be like discarded feed, manure piles maybe that haven't been moved, that have accumulated over the last few months, and you've just been waiting for an opportunity to move them. Trying to get all of those fly breeding areas eliminated is really, really important. Secondly, you have to start looking at what chemical options you might want to use. Again, if the flies are already present and biting, we're going to probably have to use some knockdown products. So that would be things that will actually kill the flies pretty much instantly. So fogging and spraying of the animals with approved pesticides are probably the best choice to knock that fly population down. Now, here's the challenge. If you've gotten behind on your game and you have significant fly populations today, you knock them down today, guess what? There's more flies hatching out from larvae around your farm. If you haven't taken care of all those sanitation issues, there's even more flies hatching out. So now you have a compounded problem. You sprayed today, guess what? Tomorrow or maybe even the next day, flies are back. Well, where did they come from? Those fly breeding areas. So save yourself some time and effort. Try to eliminate as many of those fly breeding areas as possible. And with stable flies, you have a special challenge. Those flies move out of your barns in the evening and they rest in the grass and weeds that are outside your animal housing areas. Well, this is a problem. They're not inside where premise sprays are worked. They're outside resting on the grass. And they'll come back the next day as soon as the sun comes up, usually about 9 o'clock in the morning. So you have to do something out there. Again, sanitation. Eliminate the weeds and the grass and try to keep things as mowed down as possible. That way you will reduce the laying areas for them during the evening hours. This will reduce the number of flies that you see on your animals. So with fly control, just want to remind you, sanitation is number one. Our chemical methods are good, but without good sanitation, they're not very effective. This is Mike Brouk with K-State Research and Extension.
Mike, thanks as always. And to round things out today, in addition to the Wheat Quality Council Hard Winter Wheat Tour that got going this morning, K-State Research and Extension is conducting numerous local wheat tours, and there are 3 upcoming in McPherson County this Friday, May the 20th, including one near Marquette at 10 that morning, near Mound Ridge at 1 that afternoon, and near Inman at 3 o'clock this Friday. Peering ahead to next week, a number of local wheat tours taking place near Great Bend, Newton, and Belle Plaine on Monday the 23rd, near Andale, Clearwater, and Caldwell in the Sedgwick-Sumner County area. A week from today, the 24th. Then on Wednesday the 25th, wheat tours near Russell, Lorain, and Riley. Again, for more specifics on directions for all of these, get in touch with your local Extension agricultural agent in those locations. And with that, our time's away once more. Thanks for listening in. Eric Atkinson, this has been Agriculture Today over the K-State Radio Network.